Hey guys! Tonight we're settling into a very, very long story. So, if you're here to relax, dim the lights, maybe flop into bed, and let history gently drone you into unconsciousness, you're in the right place. Now, tonight's marathon tale isn't about medieval kings who married their cousins 4 times removed, or emperors who thought bathing in donkey milk cured gout. No. Tonight, we're sticking a little closer to home. We're going to drift through the story of the civil rights movement in the United States. And yes, it is, technically, a story about protests and marches and jail time and occasionally people getting very angry. But don't worry. We're not here for excitement. We're here for the slow burn of American dysfunction, stretched out over decades. Because let's face it, if there's one thing America has always excelled at, it's loudly declaring freedom while simultaneously making sure a whole lot of people don't actually get it. So, let's tuck ourselves in and start with a gentle, meandering float back into the 19th century. Because even though people like to say the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, the truth is America had been avoiding the whole equal rights thing for, well, basically since day one. Post-slavery, but not really. The Civil War ended in 1865, slavery was technically abolished, and 4 million people who had been property now weren't. Which, on paper, sounds like progress. But the catch was obvious. You can't just end 250 years of forced labor, snap your fingers, and expect everyone to suddenly live happily ever after in racial harmony. America being America, what really happened was former enslaved people were given freedom, but then immediately shoved into a new system that tried to look like equality while being anything but. This was the era of Reconstruction, which sounds nice and hopeful. Except Reconstruction in this case meant we'll sort of rebuild the South and maybe pretend to include black citizens in democracy, but only for like 10 minutes, until white Southerners figure out how to wiggle out of it. So, from about 1865 to 1877, you actually did see black men elected to Congress, state legislatures, even local offices. It was a moment where, if you squinted, you could imagine a very different America taking shape. But then, predictably, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan formed almost instantly. Because if there's one thing certain people hate, it's the idea of sharing political power with the people they spent generations exploiting. By 1877, the federal government got tired of babysitting the South, pulled out Union troops, and basically left black citizens at the mercy of the same elites who'd owned them. What followed was the infamous Jim Crow era. Laws that were supposedly about separate but equal services, but really just an elaborate way of saying, no, you can't sit here, and no, you can't vote either. And so, the stage was set. By the early 20th century, America had perfected the art of segregation. Black schools got crumbling buildings, white schools got shiny new ones. Black neighborhoods got ignored, white neighborhoods got infrastructure. Black voters got literacy tests and poll taxes, white voters got to just walk in and scribble on the ballot. Freedom, but make it optional. So, when we talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, remember, this wasn't some brand new idea. It was more like the latest version of a fight that had been going on forever. Long before Martin Luther King Jr. was giving speeches, there were black intellectuals and activists laying the groundwork. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, who co-founded the NAACP back in 1909 and spent decades trying to prove to white America that black citizens could be scholars, writers, professionals, and, shocker, actual humans with dignity. The NAACP, by the way, stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which now sounds like it should be printed on sepia-toned stationery, but back then was radical. The NAACP mostly used lawsuits as their weapon of choice. They'd find some glaringly unequal school system or bus policy, then drag it into court, trying to chip away at Jim Crow one case at a time. This was slow, boring, and extremely lawyerly, which honestly is kind of perfect for bedtime history, because nothing says relax and drift off than decades of litigation. Strategy eventually produced one of the most famous cases in American history, Brown versus Board of Education, in 1954. And yes, it is as thrilling as it sounds, which is to say, not thrilling at all. The case combined several different lawsuits from around the country, all saying the same thing. Separate schools for black and white children were not, in fact, equal. And after much legal wrangling, the Supreme Court agreed. They declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Which sounds like a mic drop moment, except, of course, the court added the phrase that integration should happen with all deliberate speed. Translation: you have to do this, but, like, whenever you get around to it. And Southern states, being experts at dragging their feet, basically said, oh, sure, we'll integrate in the year 2525, maybe. Some counties even shut down their entire public school systems for years rather than let black and white kids sit in the same classroom. Imagine being so committed to racism that you'd rather have no schools at all.
So we left off with lunch counters being politely occupied by students, buses being torched by angry mobs, and the federal government sighing heavily and muttering, "Do we really have to deal with this right now?" Spoiler, yes they did. Let's drift gently into the early 1960s, a time of optimism, television jingles, shiny cars with fins, and the constant background hum of Jim Crow. Because nothing says land of the free like telling half your citizens where they can and cannot sit. Martin finds his microphone. Martin Luther King Jr. had already proven in Montgomery that he had a certain stage presence, the kind that made news cameras turn in his direction. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he just had that preacher cadence, the kind where you think you're sitting through a sermon, and then suddenly it's been 45 minutes and you're still nodding politely because the rhythm won't let you go. By the early 1960s, King was head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. Their big idea was simple: nonviolent protest. March, sit, sing hymns, let police drag you off on camera. It was basically political Aikido. Turn the opponent's aggression into their own defeat. Because when Middle America saw peaceful churchgoers being clubbed on TV, it was harder to pretend nothing was wrong. Of course, plenty of white politicians still tried. Their favorite line was, "We're moving too fast. Change takes time." Which is an impressive thing to say when people had already been waiting a century since emancipation. But sure, let's all be very patient. Birmingham, 1963. If you're ever looking for the civil rights movement's most notorious pressure cooker, Birmingham, Alabama is a safe bet. This was a city so committed to segregation that its public safety commissioner, Bull Connor, yes, his actual nickname was Bull, basically treated peaceful protest like a personal insult. In the spring of 1963, King and the SCLC targeted Birmingham with a series of marches and sit-ins. They knew Connor would overreact, and oh boy did he. He unleashed fire hoses, police dogs, and mass arrests. The images that hit national television were almost cinematic in their cruelty. Children knocked down by water cannons, teenagers bitten by German shepherds, adults dragged off to jail cells like it was medieval Europe. And while Connor thought he was restoring order, what he really did was hand the movement a propaganda victory. America's suburbs got a front-row seat to Southern brutality, and it was not a good look. Meanwhile, King spent some time in a Birmingham jail cell, where he scribbled his now famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. The letter is long, dense, and slightly scolding. Basically, King telling moderate white clergy, "Stop telling us to wait. We've waited long enough." It was a polite sermon disguised as a polite dressing down. The March on Washington. Now, this led to one of the most famous photo ops in American history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 1963. Now, the name sounds very grand, but the event itself was surprisingly orderly. Roughly 250,000 people gathered at the National Mall, carrying signs, singing songs, politely sweating in the DC heat. The speakers list was stacked with civil rights leaders, labor activists, and religious figures. And then, of course, there was King's speech, "I Have a Dream." You've heard it. Your high school teacher probably made you recite part of it. It's poetic, it's lofty, and it's endlessly quotable. But here's the bedtime truth. The most famous part, the actual dream riff, wasn't even in the prepared text. King started ad-libbing when Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer behind him, shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin!" And so he did. The speech sealed his status as the face of the movement, though, ironically, the Kennedy administration had been nervous about the march. They feared violence or chaos. Instead, they got the world's biggest, quietest church picnic. Kennedy's half-promise. Speaking of Kennedy, John F. himself had been cautiously supportive of civil rights. He'd made campaign promises, but like most politicians, he also didn't want to anger Southern Democrats, who were still a powerful voting bloc. So his approach was smile, say nice words, and avoid actually doing anything too bold. By 1963, however, the pressure was undeniable. After Birmingham, after Washington, JFK went on TV and said civil rights was a moral issue, which was a big deal rhetorically. He even proposed new civil rights legislation. But then, as we know, he was assassinated that November in Dallas, so his bill was left sitting in Congress like a half-written essay due the next morning. Enter Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, if there was ever a president who didn't look like a civil rights hero, it was Lyndon Baines Johnson, a tall, crude Texan who loved shouting, swearing, and intimidating people in bathrooms. But oddly enough, LBJ was exactly the man to push Kennedy's stalled bill through. He used what he called the Johnson treatment. Imagine a 6'3" Texan leaning inches from your face, jabbing his finger, alternating between threats and flattery until you gave in. Senators cracked like eggs under his routine. And so, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The act banned segregation in public places, outlawed employment discrimination, and basically killed Jim Crow on paper. Emphasis on paper, because the South wasn't about to suddenly say, "Oh, okay, we'll behave now." But still, legally, it was a turning point. Mississippi, 1964. Of course, passing a law is one thing. Actually enforcing it is another. And nowhere was this clearer than in Mississippi. That summer, civil rights groups launched Freedom Summer. Volunteers, many of them young white students from the North, traveled south to help black citizens register to vote, which again should have been simple, democracy and all that. But in Mississippi, black voter registration was basically blocked by every trick in the book. Literacy tests, impossible questionnaires, intimidation, and straight-up violence. Within the first week, 3 activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Sherner, disappeared. Their bodies were later found buried in an earthen dam, murdered by a mix of local Klansmen and law enforcement. Yes, law enforcement, always inspiring. The incident shocked the nation, but it also showed just how dangerous the fight for civil rights really was. And yet, the activists kept going, slowly, painfully, chipping away at voter suppression. Selma, 1965. And now we float toward one of the most famous marches of all, Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Voting rights in Alabama were even more of a joke than in Mississippi. In Selma, only about 2% of black citizens were registered. So activists targeted the town with demonstrations. The local sheriff, Jim Clark, was basically Bull Connor 2.0, hot-headed, violent, and overly fond of swinging a club. The first big march on March 7, 1965, became known as Bloody Sunday. Peaceful marchers started across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, only to be met with state troopers with tear gas and batons. Cameras rolled as marchers were trampled and beaten. 2 days later, King tried again, leading a second march. This time, he stopped halfway across the bridge, knelt in prayer, and turned back, not wanting another bloodbath. Finally, a third march, under federal protection, made it all the way to Montgomery. The violence in Selma had been broadcast on national TV, once again shoving the reality of Southern racism into suburban living rooms. And this time, it pushed Johnson to act. In March 1965, he went before Congress and declared, "We shall overcome," which, coming from a Texan president who cursed like a dock worker, was surprisingly poetic. The result was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It banned literacy tests, sent federal registrars to oversee elections, and gave teeth to the idea of equal suffrage. In theory, at least. A different voice, Malcolm X. Now, while King was giving sermons on nonviolence, there was another figure rising to prominence with a very different message, Malcolm X. Malcolm had grown up in rough circumstances. His father was killed when he was young, his mother institutionalized, and he spent time in prison. There, he encountered the Nation of Islam.
So, we've drifted through Birmingham hoses, Washington speeches, Selma bridges, and Johnson's booming Texan sermons about freedom. And while it would be very tidy to say, well, there you go, civil rights achieved, happily ever after. That's not how America works. Because if there's one thing this country loves more than lofty ideals, it's finding new, creative ways to not actually live up to them. Watts, 1965. Let's start with a place far from Selma, Los Angeles. Yes, California, the land of movie stars, freeways, and smog. By the mid-1960s, it was also home to a large black community, many of whom had migrated from the South for jobs and the faint promise of less suffocating racism. Except, surprise, racism was still very much alive. Housing discrimination kept black families boxed into certain neighborhoods. Jobs were scarce. Police harassment was routine. And so, when an altercation between a young black man and police officers spiraled into an arrest on a hot August night in 1965, frustration boiled over. For 6 days, the neighborhood of Watts erupted. Rioting, fires, clashes with police, National Guard troops patrolled the streets. When the smoke cleared, 34 people were dead, over 1,000 injured, and hundreds of buildings damaged. For many Americans watching on TV, this was shocking. Up to that point, civil rights had mostly been presented as peaceful marches against cartoonishly evil Southern sheriffs. Watts showed something different. The raw anger of people who felt change wasn't coming fast enough, or at all. A movement in tension. The mid to late 60s were marked by this growing split. On one side, Martin Luther King Jr. and older leaders still preached nonviolence, hoping the moral high ground would win over the broader nation. On the other side, younger activists were saying, enough patience, enough hymns, maybe it's time to fight back. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, began shifting their tone. Under leaders like Stokely Carmichael, the language of Black Power started to replace nonviolence. Black Power meant pride, independence, and sometimes self-defense. It was about no longer asking politely for inclusion, but asserting identity outright. And yes, this terrified mainstream white America, because nothing makes suburban dads clutch their pearls like the idea of oppressed people saying they actually want power. The Black Panther Party. Out of this new energy came one of the most iconic and misunderstood groups of the era, the Black Panther Party. Founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers were immediately recognizable for their leather jackets, berets, and shotguns. Their early tactic was simple: follow police around with law books and weapons, making sure officers didn't abuse black citizens. Perfectly legal under California's open carry laws at the time, but unsettling to the establishment. Of course, the Panthers weren't just about armed patrols. They also set up free breakfast programs for kids, health clinics, and community education. But the image that stuck, thanks to media coverage and FBI smear campaigns, was of scary radicals with guns. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, declared the Panthers the greatest threat to internal security in the U.S., which is saying something, considering this was also the decade of the Cold War, nuclear missiles, and, actual wars. But Hoover was fixated. He launched COINTELPRO, a secret program to infiltrate and disrupt black activist groups, often using illegal methods. The goal? Fracture the movement from within. And unfortunately, it worked. King's final years. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King Jr. found himself in a difficult position. By 1966, he wasn't just marching in the South anymore. He turned his attention northward, to Chicago, where housing discrimination kept black families locked into certain neighborhoods. King and his team staged marches through all white areas, only to be greeted with jeers, thrown bottles, and violent resistance. It was a reminder that racism wasn't a Southern quirk, it was national. At the same time, King began speaking out against poverty and the Vietnam War. He argued that civil rights meant nothing without economic justice, and that young black men shouldn't be dying in Southeast Asia for freedoms they didn't enjoy at home. This broadened his mission, but it also alienated some allies. Politicians who could tolerate King talking about bus seats got nervous when he started talking about wealth redistribution and anti-war protests. Donations dropped. Newspapers criticized him. Even other activists thought he was spreading himself too thin. By 1968, King was preparing a Poor People's Campaign, a massive push for economic justice. But first, he traveled to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. Memphis, April 1968. The sanitation workers in Memphis had been on strike for weeks. Their demand was simple: fair wages and safe working conditions. The city, predictably, resisted. King arrived to lend his support, delivering a speech at the Mason Temple on April 3rd. It was one of his most famous in hindsight because of its eerie foreshadowing. He spoke of having been to the mountaintop, of seeing the promised land, and of not fearing death. He said, "I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land." The next evening, April 4th, King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was shot and killed by an assassin's bullet. He was just 39 years old. The news spread like wildfire. Cities across the country erupted in grief and anger. Riots broke out in more than 100 urban areas. The nation mourned, but also fractured further. For many, it felt like the dream had died with him. Aftermath of a loss. In the wake of King's assassination, the movement stumbled. There were still leaders. Ralph Abernathy continued the Poor People's Campaign, Coretta Scott King became a powerful voice, others like Jesse Jackson stepped forward. But without King's unifying presence, the energy scattered. At the same time, the federal government pushed through one more major piece of legislation, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which banned discrimination in housing sales and rentals, a direct response to the very battles King had been fighting in Chicago. It was a symbolic capstone to the civil rights era. But the reality on the ground was messier. White flight to the suburbs, economic inequality, and systemic barriers ensured that segregation lingered. Laws could change quickly, social habits not so much. A shift in tone. By the late 60s, the civil rights movement had evolved into a broader, more fractured struggle. Some groups focused on Black power and cultural pride. Others tried to keep pushing through the courts. Meanwhile, younger generations began questioning whether the old tactics still applied. You can almost picture the vibe, the calm, church-driven marches of the early decade giving way to a louder, angrier, more radical energy. From "We shall overcome" to "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." Both messages valid, both reflecting the frustrations of a community that had been told over and over to wait just a little longer. And of course, the larger American backdrop was also in turmoil. Vietnam, student protests, assassinations of not just King, but also Robert F. Kennedy. The whole country seemed to be vibrating with unrest. For civil rights activists, the question was no longer just, can we desegregate lunch counters? It's, what does equality actually mean in a society built on inequality? A much bigger, messier problem. Quiet legacies. Despite the chaos, the victories of the 1960s left permanent marks. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. These laws didn't solve everything, but they gave activists legal tools to fight with in the decades ahead. And the images, children facing fire hoses, marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, King at the Lincoln Memorial, stuck in the national consciousness. They became shorthand for justice, even if the reality was slower, harder, and less glamorous. The movement's leaders, both the ones who preached patience and the ones who demanded power, reshaped American identity. They forced the nation to confront its contradictions, even if those contradictions never fully went away. And that's where we'll let Part 3 rest. We've drifted through riots and radicals, through King's mountaintop and his tragic fall. The late 1960s left the civil rights movement at once victorious and fractured, celebrated and criticized, remembered and resisted. In Part 4, we'll gently glide into the aftershocks, the 1970s and beyond, the slow march of affirmative action battles, busing controversies, voting rights challenges, and the way the civil rights movement kept echoing long after the cameras moved on.
So, we've made it through the 60s. Civil Rights Acts passed, bridges marched, leaders assassinated, cities smoldering, suburbs nervously clutching pearls. You'd think, at this point, America might have paused to say, okay, we've learned our lesson, let's all just get along now. But of course, this is America, which means instead of harmony, what we actually got was decades of arguing over what equality should look like, how much was too much, and whether the country had already done enough. Spoiler, not really. Picking up the pieces. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in 1968, the movement lost its unifying figure. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference tried to carry on under Ralph Abernathy, but it just wasn't the same. Without King's preacher charisma, that weird combination of fire and lullaby, momentum slowed. Other groups splintered. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, once a powerhouse of youthful activism, had already shifted toward black power and was falling apart under internal tensions and FBI harassment. The Black Panther Party, once the cool kids with leather jackets, got hammered by arrests, infighting, and constant surveillance. So the late 60s and early 70s felt less like a triumphant finale and more like a messy come-down. The legislative victories were real, the cultural impact was undeniable, but unity? Gone. The era of backlash. If there's one constant in U.S. history, it's backlash. Every time progress inches forward, a sizable chunk of the country says, "Wait, that's too much!" By the 1970s, many white Americans convinced themselves that the civil rights movement was over. Racism solved, nothing to see here. When black activists kept pointing out ongoing discrimination in housing, schools, jobs, and policing, the response was often, "Stop complaining, you already got your rights." Politicians picked up on this mood. Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, pushed what he called the Southern Strategy. Translation, appeal to white voters angry about desegregation and social change, but do it with coded language. Talk about law and order. Talk about states' rights. Don't say, "We love Jim Crow," but wink hard enough that everyone gets the message. It worked. The South, once loyal to the Democratic Party, began flipping Republican. Civil rights had changed the law, but it also rearranged the political map. School busing. One of the biggest flashpoints of the 1970s was school busing. Remember Brown v. Board of Education back in 1954? The Supreme Court said schools must be integrated with all deliberate speed. Well, 2 decades later, many schools were still mostly segregated, thanks to neighborhood patterns and housing discrimination. So courts came up with a new plan: bus children across town to different schools to balance racial enrollment. It was clumsy, controversial, and, you guessed it, deeply unpopular with a lot of white families. The image of angry parents screaming at buses full of black children became iconic. Northern cities like Boston saw protests that looked eerily similar to Southern mobs from a decade earlier. Turns out, racism wasn't a regional quirk, it was a national pastime. Affirmative action. Another hot topic was affirmative action. The basic idea, if institutions had been discriminating for centuries, maybe they should actively try to include people of color in jobs and schools. Seems logical,
But when universities began admitting more black students, or when businesses set diversity goals, lawsuits flew in. Critics called it reverse discrimination, because apparently centuries of one-sided exclusion didn't count as discrimination, but a handful of scholarships definitely did. The Supreme Court weighed in with the famous 1978 case, Regents of the University of California v. Bakke. The court ruled that strict racial quotas were unconstitutional, but that race could be considered as one factor among others in admissions. A very lawyerly middle ground. The debate has continued, sleepily but persistently, ever since. Voting rights, the long game. Remember the Voting Rights Act of 1965? It required federal oversight of states with a history of voter suppression. For a while, it made a real difference. Black voter registration soared. Black candidates began winning offices in the South for the first time since Reconstruction. But naturally, pushback came. States kept looking for sneaky ways to limit participation, moving polling places, requiring complicated ID, purging voter rolls. It was less blatant than literacy tests, but the goal was the same: make voting harder for the people least likely to support the old power structure. And over time, Supreme Court decisions chipped away at the act. In 2013, much later than our sleepy 1970s focus, but worth foreshadowing, the court gutted the key oversight provisions, saying things had changed. Which is a bit like saying you don't need an umbrella anymore because it stopped raining once last week. The Black political movement. Despite the backlash, there were real advances. In 1967, Carl Stokes became the first black mayor of a major U.S. city, Cleveland. Other cities followed, with mayors in Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and beyond. Shirley Chisholm, elected to Congress in 1968, became the first black woman in that role. By 1972, she even ran for president in the Democratic primaries. These milestones didn't magically fix inequality, but they chipped away at the old narrative that political power was off limits. Representation became a quiet but significant victory of the era. Culture shifts. The 1970s also saw black culture take a more central role in American life. The black arts movement flourished, soul music and funk dominated the airwaves. Films like Shaft and Superfly brought blaxploitation to the big screen. Problematic in some ways, empowering in others. Television introduced more black characters, from Good Times to the Jeffersons, though usually framed for white audiences' comfort. It wasn't a revolution, but it was visibility. And visibility, like legislation, matters in the long, slow crawl of change. Drifting into the 1980s. By the time Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, the civil rights narrative had shifted again. Reagan loved to invoke the idea of America as a colorblind land of opportunity, which sounds nice, except his policies often cut funding for social programs and downplayed systemic inequality. He opposed certain aspects of affirmative action. He framed welfare programs as bloated and exploitative, feeding into stereotypes about poor black families. The drug war ramped up under his administration, disproportionately targeting black communities and fueling mass incarceration. So while the civil rights era had ended de jure segregation, de facto inequality persisted, reinforced by new systems. The movement's legacy. By the 1990s and 2000s, Civil rights history was often packaged as a closed chapter. Textbooks presented Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and the March on Washington as neat little morality tales. The rough edges, the debates, the radicals, the backlash got sanded down. King was turned into a safe, saintly figure, quoted mostly for "I have a dream," but rarely for his critiques of capitalism or militarism. Malcolm X was rehabilitated into kind of edgy counterpoint, without much discussion of the anger that drove his early years. The Black Panthers were reduced to scary images, not free breakfast programs. In other words, the civil rights movement was remembered, but selectively. Echoes into today. Of course, the issues the movement fought over never fully went away.
So, here we are. We've passed through the dramatic highs of the 1960s, the messy aftermath of the 1970s, and the Reagan-era tight smiles of the 1980s. The civil rights movement, as it existed in its golden years, was officially over, which meant America did what it always does with uncomfortable history. It declared victory, closed the book, and put the whole thing on a shelf next to World War II nostalgia and the moon landing. But, as we've already noticed, history doesn't really end. It just gets quieter until someone shakes the snow globe again. 1980s, colorblind conservatism. Ronald Reagan swept into office in 1980 with promises of morning in America. He liked to talk about a nation where opportunity was open to all, no matter race. Sounds uplifting. But his policies often trimmed back the very programs civil rights activists had fought to create. Funding for urban communities? Cut. Affirmative action? Cast as unfair. The Voting Rights Act was renewed reluctantly. And then there was the war on drugs, which was marketed as a neutral fight against crime, but ended up targeting black communities disproportionately. Crack cocaine penalties were far harsher than powder cocaine penalties, and it just so happened that crack circulated in poorer, urban, largely black neighborhoods. Arrest rates skyrocketed, prisons filled, families fractured, and the same news outlets that had once shown Martin Luther King Jr. in grainy black and white now plastered mugshots across color TVs, reinforcing stereotypes. So, yes, the 80s were technically colorblind, but in the way a person closing their eyes is also light blind. The 1990s, Rodney King and Los Angeles on fire. If the 1980s were a polite smile over lingering inequality, the 1990s ripped the mask off. In 1991, a black motorist named Rodney King was beaten by 4 white Los Angeles police officers after a high-speed chase. The beating was caught on videotape. Shaky, grainy home camcorder footage, but unmistakable. The officers struck him over and over while King lay on the ground. For once, the brutality wasn't just whispered about, it was visible. Broadcast on TV, replay after replay. The nation watched. And yet, in 1992, a jury acquitted the officers. The response? Los Angeles erupted. Riots spread for days. Businesses burned. More than 60 people died. The National Guard rolled in, and America realized, in case it had forgotten, that racial inequality and police violence weren't relics of the 1960s. They were alive, breathing, and angry. The LA riots became a grim milestone, a reminder that you can legislate civil rights, but you can't legislate away resentment, inequality, or centuries of mistrust. The 2000s. The new millennium illusion. The 2000s brought a strange mix of optimism and denial. On one hand, diversity was more visible. Black entertainers, athletes, and politicians were front and center. Oprah was a billionaire. Jay-Z was a mogul. By 2008,
Barack Obama was elected president, a moment many framed as proof that America had moved beyond race. Cue the headlines, the first post-racial America. Cue the smug think pieces about Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream finally realized. And yet, beneath the surface, the cracks were there. Black wealth still lagged far behind white wealth. School segregation quietly re-emerged through housing patterns. Prisons remained packed, disproportionately with black men. Police shootings continued. The optimism was real, but fragile. Obama himself acknowledged as much. He spoke of hope and unity, but he also had to navigate constant racist dog whistles. His presidency was historic, yes, but it didn't erase the struggle. It just highlighted the distance between symbolism and reality. The 2010s, Black Lives Matter. In 2013, the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the man who shot 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, sparked a new phrase, Black Lives Matter. What began as a hashtag grew into a movement. Then came Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in New York, Tamir Rice in Cleveland. Video after video, protest after protest. The familiar images of marches, raised fists, police lines, echoes of Selma and Birmingham, but this time streamed live on social media. Black Lives Matter wasn't the same as the old civil rights movement. It was decentralized, less about charismatic leaders and more about collective voices. But the goals were familiar: justice, accountability, the right to exist without constant suspicion or violence. And once again, backlash arrived. All lives matter became the new "why can't you be patient?" Politicians denounced protesters as divisive. News outlets debated whether kneeling during the national anthem was disrespectful. The cycle continued. The long continuum. So, at this point, you might be tempted to ask, is this just history repeating itself? And the answer is, sort of. The civil rights movement of the 1960s won laws, yes. It changed the culture, yes. But the deeper structures of inequality didn't vanish. They just adapted. Segregation morphed into school choice. Voter suppression rebranded as election security. Stereotypes softened around the edges, but reappeared in coded language. It was the same melody, played on new instruments. That's why when protests flared in the 2010s and 2020s, they felt familiar, because they were, not in every detail, but in rhythm, in resistance, in backlash. And 2020 and beyond. And then came 2020, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, filmed on a bystander's phone, set off protests across the world. Millions marched, not just in American cities, but in London, Paris, Tokyo, and beyond. Statues of Confederate generals were pulled down. Corporations rushed to tweet out Black Lives Matter, even as they quietly profited from inequality. For a moment, it felt like the largest civil rights movement in history. And in a way, it was. Not in centralized leadership, but in sheer global scale. Of course, the backlash arrived just as quickly. Politicians denounced defund the police as radical. Laws were passed restricting how race could be taught in schools. Once again, progress and resistance braided together like mismatched dance partners who can't stop stepping on each other's toes. The sleepy truth. So, where does that leave us in this never-ending bedtime story? The civil rights movement wasn't one event. It wasn't even one era. It was, and still is, a rolling wave. Sometimes it crashes loudly, like in Selma or Ferguson. Sometimes it pulls back into quiet frustration. Sometimes it looks like new legislation. Sometimes it looks like a mural on a street. And yes, it's exhausting. Change is slow. Progress is fragile. Backlash is predictable. But if we zoom out far enough, we can see a line, jagged, imperfect, but real, stretching from slavery's end to Reconstruction, to Jim Crow, to Montgomery, to Washington, to Ferguson, and beyond. Not a straight line, of course, more like a meandering river, sometimes blocked, sometimes diverted, but still flowing, drifting to the present. So, as you lie there, maybe half asleep, here's the gentle reminder. The civil rights movement didn't end. It never will, not in the neat way textbooks pretend. It just keeps unfolding, reshaping itself with each generation. Rosa Parks refusing to give up a seat. Martin Luther King Jr. dreaming of justice. Malcolm X demanding respect. Rodney King asking, "Can we all get along?" Ferguson's streets echoing with chants, and countless nameless people who didn't make the headlines but still marched, still voted, still believed things could be better. The story is unfinished, and maybe that's why it lulls us even now, because history, like sleep, never really stops. It just cycles. And with that, we'll let Part 5 trail off. If you're still awake, congratulations. If not, then honestly, perfect. That's what this was meant for.
So, you thought 2020 was the climax, didn't you? Millions in the streets, statues tumbling, corporations suddenly pretending they cared about justice. It felt like a grand finale. But history rarely does finales. It just meanders forward like a half-asleep river, bumping into the same rocks over and over again. Which brings us to the After 2020 chapter, a chapter that is less about bold new beginnings and more about, well, the same old debates reheated in a slightly different microwave. The Great Reckoning that wasn't. In those first months after George Floyd's killing, the air buzzed with talk of a reckoning. Cities painted Black Lives Matter across their main streets in bright yellow letters. Politicians pledged reforms. Police departments made promises. Book sales on anti-racism spiked. For a hot second, it looked like America was going to finally wrestle with the deep, tangled roots of inequality. And then, life went on. Budgets stayed mostly the same. The slogans faded. The people who once declared themselves allies quietly went back to brunch. Progress existed, yes, but it was patchy and uneven. Because America loves the idea of a quick fix, a magic speech, a symbolic mural, a single law that makes everything better. But racism, as we've established over 5 long, sleepy parts, is not exactly a one-season problem. It's the kind of problem that keeps renewing itself like a bad TV show. The backlash. Of course. Naturally, backlash came fast. States passed laws limiting how teachers could discuss racism in classrooms. They slapped labels like critical race theory on pretty much anything remotely uncomfortable, from lessons on slavery to books about Rosa Parks. Parents showed up at school board meetings yelling that their children were being indoctrinated because they learned that racism once existed, which is a bit like saying learning about gravity is indoctrination because it makes you fall down. And politicians, ever attuned to which way the cultural winds are blowing, leaned hard into it, banning books, policing curriculum, rebranding history as heritage. Because nothing says progress like frantically erasing the memory of how we got here. Protest in the digital age. Another change worth noting. Activism itself has gone digital. In the 1960s, you needed bodies in the street, megaphones, mimeograph flyers. In the 2020s, you need a hashtag, a viral video, maybe a TikTok trend. This doesn't make the activism less real, but it does make it faster. Information spreads instantly. Outrage spreads instantly. And, unfortunately, misinformation spreads instantly too. One video of police violence can spark marches in a dozen cities overnight, but one misleading clip can also fuel conspiracy theories just as quickly. It's a constant tug of war between visibility and distortion.
The civil rights struggle, like everything else, is now caught in the algorithm. Symbolic gestures versus structural change. Another sleepy observation: America loves symbols, kneeling athletes, rainbow-colored brand logos, award shows with carefully balanced lineups. These gestures are loud, visible, and very marketable. But structural change? That's less photogenic. Fixing school funding gaps, reforming housing policies, tackling mass incarceration, that's hard, that's boring, and it doesn't trend on Twitter. So, once again, the civil rights struggle often gets stuck at the level of optics. Everyone wants to look like they're doing something, few want to actually do the heavy lifting. The ongoing struggles. Even as slogans faded, the core issues stayed. Voting rights, states introduced new laws restricting mail-in voting, reducing polling places, and requiring strict IDs. Advocates saw this as 21st century voter suppression. Opponents framed it as election security, déjà vu from the 1960s. Policing, calls for reform led to some changes, more body cameras, more community programs, but the deeper culture of policing remained stubborn. Shootings still happened, cases still went viral, anger still simmered. Economic inequality, the wealth gap between black and white families persisted, shaped by centuries of disadvantage that no single program could erase. Home ownership, employment, healthcare, all showed lingering disparities. It was the same old symphony, just with digital violins. Generational shifts. But here's a calmer, more hopeful note. Each generation seems slightly less willing to accept the status quo. Polls show younger Americans are more racially tolerant, more aware of systemic issues, and more open to discussing uncomfortable truths. Of course, that doesn't mean they've solved everything. It just means the fight keeps regenerating. Old activists age out, new ones log in, the melody continues, even if the instruments change. The civil rights brand. Strangely enough, the civil rights movement has become a brand. Martin Luther King Jr. quotes show up on coffee mugs. Streets get renamed. Corporations borrow the imagery to market sneakers. The radical, messy, dangerous movement of the 1960s is now often repackaged as a neat little morality tale with a happy ending. Except, as we know, the ending hasn't happened yet, which makes the branding feel a little hollow, like selling Diet Revolution in a can. But it also shows how deeply the language of civil rights has sunk into American identity. Everyone wants to claim it, even those who oppose its goals. The global dimension. It's also worth noting that the struggle has never been purely American. Civil rights inspired and was inspired by movements abroad, anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, decolonialization in Africa and Asia, indigenous rights in Australia and Canada. The language of justice and equality crossed borders, even if the specific context differed. And today, when protests erupt in the US, they often echo internationally. Statues fall in Britain, police violence gets debated in France, solidarity spreads faster than ever before, even if solutions remain stubbornly local. Where we drift from here. So, where does this story leave? Honestly, exactly where it began. Unfinished. Slavery ended, but racism remained. Jim Crow ended, but inequality remained. Segregation ended, but separation remained. The civil rights movement forced laws to change, but culture lags behind law, and systems lag behind culture. It's a game of endless catch-up. That's not meant to sound bleak. If anything, it's just realistic. Change is slow. Always has been, always will be. The march goes on, whether led by a preacher in Montgomery, a student in Greensboro, or a protester live streaming from Minneapolis. A sleepy reflection. So, as we float toward the end of this marathon saga, here's the lullaby thought. Civil rights is less a movement than a pulse, sometimes steady, sometimes racing, sometimes faint, but always there. It will never be finished in a neat, satisfying way,
There will never be a final victory parade where everyone cheers and racism officially retires. Instead, there will be endless cycles of progress, resistance, adaptation, and memory. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that the civil rights movement was a heroic story with a beginning and an end, but that it's an ongoing condition, woven into the DNA of America, for better and worse. So, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just trudged through 6 parts of the longest, most sleepy retelling of modern civil rights history ever attempted. And if you nodded off somewhere around colorblind conservatism, well, good. That's what this was all for.
Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to tonight's very calm little history ramble. If you're here, I'm guessing you're already in bed, lights down, phone brightness turned way, way down, and probably fighting the urge to check your notifications one last time. Don't worry, they'll be there in the morning. Tonight is not about emails or chores. Tonight we're heading back a few thousand years into the desert where some very ambitious pharaohs decided that the best way to spend their unlimited power and their people's free time was stacking rocks, very big rocks, for decades. Yes, we're talking about the Great Pyramids of Egypt, those giant stone triangles that everyone knows but no one really understands. Built thousands of years ago, still standing while most modern buildings crumble after a few decades. And the funny thing is, for all our technology, for all our satellites and laser scans and "we're so smart now" attitude, we still don't actually know every detail of how they were built. Which means you get to close your eyes, listen, and picture a lot of sweaty ancient Egyptians dragging limestone blocks while their pharaoh sits in the shade, probably being fanned by servants and muttering things like, "Yes, higher. No, taller. Bigger than my dad's pyramid, obviously." So, let's glide back to around 2600 BCE. This is Old Kingdom Egypt. It's hot, it's sandy, and it's run by kings who thought they were gods. Literally gods. Imagine a politician today not just asking for your vote, but for your eternal worship. Pharaohs didn't campaign, they commanded. And their #1 priority? Making sure that when they eventually keeled over, their tomb was basically a VIP lounge for the afterlife. Now, before pyramids, Egypt's royals were buried in what were called mastabas, which were not very pyramid-like, more like big, flat rectangles of mud brick. They worked fine, but of course someone decided flat rectangles were just too humble. Enter Pharaoh Djoser. Djoser said, I'd like something a little taller, a little flashier. Let's stack some mastabas on top of each other like a very boring wedding cake." And just like that, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara was born. This was the first pyramid-shaped thing in history. It looked like stairs because, well, it literally was stairs. And the genius behind it? An architect named Imhotep. Yes, that Imhotep. Later turned into a weird villain in the Mummy movies. But in real life, he was more like the Steve Jobs of ancient Egypt. Smart, innovative, loved geometry. Imhotep basically invented stone architecture in Egypt, which was a pretty big deal, considering everyone else was still messing around with mud bricks that fell apart every time it rained. But let's float forward, because the real drama, the real stone flexing, came later with the 4th dynasty. This is where we get to the Great Pyramids at Giza. You've seen them in a million documentaries, postcards, or probably as a random desktop wallpaper when you first got your computer in 2006. 3 giant pyramids lined up dramatically on the edge of the desert. They've been standing there for over 4,000 years while empires rose and fell, while Alexander the Great rolled through, while Napoleon supposedly looked up at them and told his soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you, which was probably his way of saying, stop complaining about the heat, you're not special. So who actually ordered these monster structures? 3 kings, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, father, son, and grandson, which means yes, the Great Pyramids were basically one very elaborate family rivalry. Let's start with Khufu, also known to the Greeks as Cheops. If you've ever seen the Great Pyramid, that's his. The biggest, the boldest, the "look at me, I'm king of everything" kind of pyramid. Standing originally at 481 feet tall, built out of around 2.3 million stone blocks, which is absurd. That's like telling your people, hey, I want you to build me a mountain, but don't use nature, just carry blocks that weigh a few tons each, one at a time, and stack them until I'm satisfied. Now, if you're wondering what Khufu was like as a person, well, ancient sources don't paint him in a very flattering light. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, described him as a cruel tyrant who closed all the temples, forced everyone into slavery, and basically ran Egypt like a cranky old landlord. But the thing is, Herodotus was writing long after Khufu was dead, which means it's entirely possible he was just recycling gossip, because people love to trash talk dead kings. And let's be honest, if you're the guy who builds the world's largest tomb for yourself, people are going to call you arrogant whether you deserve it or not. Either way, Khufu wasn't remembered as Khufu the kind-hearted. He was remembered as Khufu, the guy with the really, really big pyramid, which in pharaonic terms is probably exactly what he wanted. His afterlife Yelp review was 5 stars in stonemasonry, 1 star in customer service. Now, the Great Pyramid itself, let's slow down and imagine it. Huge limestone blocks, stacked with eerie precision, covering an area of 13 acres. Inside, narrow passageways, strange chambers, shafts pointing at the stars. And to this day, we still don't know all the secrets hidden inside. In fact, just a few years ago, scientists used muon scans, basically cosmic ray X-rays for giant rocks, and discovered there might be hidden voids, secret chambers still tucked away inside Khufu's pyramid, which is kind of wild considering it's been standing there for 45 centuries. And we're still saying, maybe there's a whole room we missed. And then there's the mystery of how it was built. People love to imagine alien forklifts or advanced lost technologies or some secret ancient crane system. The truth is probably less flashy. Ramps. Lots and lots of ramps. Straight ramps, zigzag ramps, spiraling ramps. Egyptians were really good at ropes, sledges, and teamwork, and also at not giving their workers much of a choice in the matter. Though, to be fair, recent archaeology suggests they weren't all miserable slaves. Many were skilled laborers who got decent food, housing, and probably a lifetime of back pain. But let's not get lost in the engineering, because the people behind these pyramids are honestly funnier than the pyramids themselves. After Khufu, along comes his son, Khafre. And Khafre clearly looked at Dad's pyramid and thought, yeah, I'll do that too. His pyramid is slightly smaller, but still massive. And to make up for the size difference, he threw in the Sphinx. You know, the giant lion statue with the human face that looks suspiciously like it's been through a sandblasting incident. The Sphinx has stared blankly at the desert for thousands of years, its nose long gone, its smile frozen in eternal judgment. People have argued forever about whose face it's supposed to be, but the general consensus is that it's Khafre, which means, yes, he gave himself a 240-foot-long lion body as a statue, because why not? If you can't be taller than Dad's pyramid, just sculpt yourself into a mythological creature instead. That'll show him. Khafre also had a reputation for being, not exactly nice. Ancient sources claimed he was just as ruthless as Khufu, if not worse, which honestly might just be standard pharaoh PR at this point. It's like every time someone wrote history, they couldn't resist adding, oh, and by the way, he was also kind of a jerk. And then, rounding out this little family dynasty, we have Menkaure, Khafre's son. Now, Menkaure went for a pyramid that was noticeably smaller, only about 200 feet tall, which makes him seem like the underachiever of the group. But ancient sources actually described him as kinder, more generous, less obsessed with being intimidating. Apparently, people actually liked him, which of course meant his pyramid ended up half the size, because in history, the nice guys rarely get the biggest monuments. But still, Menkauri's pyramid is unique. It was partly covered in granite instead of just limestone, giving it a slightly fancier look. But even that didn't save it from later pharaohs or grave robbers. By the time archaeologists got to it, the interior was basically ransacked. Welcome to the eternal problem of being a pharaoh. You spend decades building a house for your dead body, only for someone centuries later to break in and say, "Cool treasure, mine now." So let's drift for a moment, because that's really the secret of the pyramids. They weren't just tombs. They were propaganda in stone, giant symbols meant to scream, "I am eternal, I am divine, I am richer than you could ever imagine." And yet, despite all the effort, almost every pyramid was robbed within a few hundred years. Which is kind of the most ironic historical punchline imaginable. You order the world's biggest tomb to protect your stuff, and all it does is advertise, "Hey robbers, the good loot's in here." So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, think of Khufu staring proudly at his Great Pyramid, convinced he had beaten time itself. And then picture some ancient grave robber sneaking in with a chisel and saying, "Thanks, Pharaoh, this'll fetch a good price." But let's not stop at the pyramids themselves, because the kings who built them lived in a world that was every bit as strange, petty, and dysfunctional as later royal courts. And honestly, that's where the really fun, sleepy history gossip begins.
So we've set the stage. You're picturing the Great Pyramids, glowing under the moonlight, sitting smugly in the desert like giant granite flexes. But as with all things in history, the stones aren't really the point. It's the people behind them. And in Egypt's case, that means kings who thought they were gods, queens who sometimes ran the show from the shadows, and families that redefine the word dysfunctional. Let's ease into that world. The Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were being built, is sometimes called the Age of the Pyramids, which is neat branding, but it was also the age of pharaohs behaving badly. Because when you grow up being told you're literally divine, your ego doesn't exactly stay humble. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, which meant, in theory, they were wise, just, and semi-immortal. In practice, they were moody, paranoid, and obsessed with making sure their tombs had enough shiny stuff in them. Take Khufu again. We already said he wasn't remembered as warm and cuddly, but let's talk about how his people actually viewed him. Imagine being an Egyptian farmer, dragged away from your fields to go move limestone blocks for 20 years. Every sunrise, the same sun-baked shift, dragging a sled while some overseer yells at you to pull harder, the God King demands it. You'd probably start to resent your divine leader, which might explain why, centuries later, Egyptians themselves remembered Khufu as a bit of a tyrant. Not just the Greeks throwing shade, even his own people kind of agreed. There's an old Egyptian tale called the Westcar Papyrus, written long after Khufu's time, but featuring him as a character. And in it, he's portrayed as, well, kind of an entitled jerk who sits around being entertained with magic tricks, which sounds harmless enough, but the story makes it clear he was more interested in distracting himself than actually governing. So, even in ancient bedtime stories, Khufu was already being roasted. Now, slide your mind over to Khafra, his son. We said his pyramid was almost as big, and he probably gave us the Sphinx. But his reign wasn't all majestic statues. Khafra was remembered, again mostly through later gossip, as doubling down on the whole divine tyrant act. According to some accounts, he continued closing temples, restricted freedoms, and basically reminded everyone daily, yes, my father may have been hated, but don't worry, I'm just as bad. Which raises the question, why did this dynasty last so long if everyone despised them? The answer? Divine branding. When the state religion tells you the guy on the throne is literally a god, rebellion doesn't sound like a smart career move. But don't worry, the family had its quirks too. Pharaohs didn't just marry anyone. They often married their sisters, or half-sisters, or nieces. Because when you believe your bloodline is divine, you don't want to dilute it with mere mortals. You keep it in the family, even if your family tree starts looking less like a tree and more like a very unfortunate shrub. And yes, this eventually leads to the classic royal inbreeding problems that show up all across history. But in Old Kingdom Egypt, it was simply business as usual. You're the living god, she's your divine sibling. Congratulations, it's a match made in heaven. Now, Menkaure, the grandson in this little trio, is often remembered as the good one. Supposedly kinder, supposedly more generous. Ancient Egyptian sources, or what little survived, painted him as the king who finally cut people some slack, which is adorable until you remember his pyramid is half the size of his dad's. So his kindness may have been less about a big heart and more about having fewer resources. Historians debate whether Egypt was actually running out of money and manpower by his reign, which would make sense, after all. You can't keep building mountains of stone forever without your economy feeling a little drained. But Menkaure did stand out. He also had a queen, Khmer-Nebti II, who's sometimes depicted alongside him in statues. And if you've ever seen those statues, you'll notice something subtle but unusual. She's standing right next to him, almost equal in height, arm wrapped around him. That's rare in Egyptian royal art, where pharaohs usually tower over their wives to show dominance. So either Menkaure really was more respectful, or the sculptor was just feeling bold that day. Either way, their statues look like the closest thing to a power couple in the pyramid era. Of course, life in the palace wasn't all marble statues and loving embraces. Pharaohs had harems, courtiers, and family members constantly plotting for influence. Imagine the drama of any modern royal family, then multiply it by desert heat and divine egos. Siblings married siblings, sons plotted against fathers, uncles schemed behind the throne. The pyramids might look timeless and stable, but behind the walls, it was just a regular royal soap opera with eyeliner. Speaking of eyeliner, let's drift briefly into daily life. We tend to picture Egyptians as endlessly solemn, wrapped in linen, chanting prayers, but in reality, they were people. They had fashion trends, bad hair days, and too much beer at festivals. In fact, beer was the daily drink of choice, cleaner than Nile water, packed with calories, and yes, given to workers at pyramid sites. Some archaeologists think workers were basically paid in bread and beer, which means the Great Pyramid wasn't just built on limestone, it was built on carbs. And while we're here, let's talk about the workers again. Forget the Hollywood image of whips and chains. Sure, there was harsh labor, but evidence suggests the pyramid builders lived in organized villages, with bakeries, breweries, and even medical care. Excavations found bones showing healed injuries, meaning workers were treated, not just discarded. So it makes the whole enterprise sound less like a death camp and more like the world's longest, hardest government job. You didn't get vacation days, but at least you got bread, beer, and a bandage if you broke your leg. Still, for all the resources poured into these projects, the irony remains: not a single pharaoh's body has been found inside the Great Pyramids. Grave robbers, erosion, or maybe just ancient clerical errors, whatever the reason, the pyramids ended up as empty husks. Which makes you wonder if Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure would be proud of their eternal monuments, or just really annoyed that someone stole the furniture. Now, let's take a slow step sideways, because pyramids weren't just about the kings. They were also about religion. The shape itself, that sharp triangular slope, symbolized the sun's rays, a staircase to the heavens. The whole structure was meant to channel the king's soul up into the sky to merge with the sun god Ra, which is poetic if you don't think too hard about the logistics. Imagine spending your entire life building a pyramid, also one guy's soul can use it as a personal launchpad. And while we're floating on that thought, remember, ancient Egypt wasn't timeless. the Old Kingdom eventually collapsed. Droughts, famines, political breakdowns. The pyramids stood tall, but the government behind them fell apart, which is almost the ultimate bedtime metaphor. All human ambition eventually crumbles, but the rocks we stack in the desert might outlast us all. Of course, in the centuries that followed, people kept trying to copy the pyramid idea, but none were as grand as Khufu's. Later pyramids were smaller, sloppier, and often fell apart, which is a little embarrassing. Imagine being the great-great-grandson of the guy who built the Great Pyramid, and your version looks like a lopsided sandcastle. Not the kind of thing you want in your divine resume. And yet, the obsession with monumental tombs never stopped. Even when pyramids faded out, Egyptians built huge temples, elaborate Valley of the King's tombs, and giant statues of themselves, because apparently being remembered was more important than ruling wisely. A pattern we've seen again and again in history. When in doubt, build something tall and put your name on it. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember, behind every stone block was a worker with sore muscles. Behind every grand design was an ego in royal sandals. And behind every pyramid was a family of kings trying desperately to outdo each other in the art of being remembered. And of course, we're only scratching the surface, because if we wander just a little deeper into Egyptian history, past the Pyramid Age, past the Old Kingdom, we'll find even stranger kings, weirder queens, and dynasties that make Khufu's family look almost normal. But we'll get there, slowly.
So when we last left off, the Old Kingdom was collapsing. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, their giant pyramids still loomed on the desert horizon, but their government had kind of fallen apart. Turns out you can't just keep dragging giant rocks forever and expect society to run smoothly. Egypt slipped into what historians blandly call the First Intermediate Period, which translated into normal language means everything went wrong. Crops failed, regional governors started acting like mini-kings, and pharaohs suddenly weren't as convincing when they said, "I'm the divine ruler of all things." Because when people are starving, the divine ruler looks less like a god and more like a guy hoarding the last loaf of bread. So yes, chaos. The central government collapsed, rival dynasties squabbled, local warlords did their thing. Imagine the Egyptian version of medieval feudalism, but with more sand. But because Egyptian history runs on cycles like a badly scripted soap opera, eventually order was restored. Enter the Middle Kingdom, around 2050 BCE. A new dynasty, led by Mentuhotep II, pulled things back together. His great achievement? Unifying Egypt again, which sounds impressive but was probably less about brilliant diplomacy and more about beating up enough rivals until everyone agreed to listen. Mentuhotep built himself a flashy tomb too, though not a giant pyramid. By this time, pyramids were a little out of fashion, partly because everyone had seen how badly they got robbed. Nothing kills a trend like realizing your 1,000-year stone investment is just gonna get looted by the time your grandchildren are born. So tombs started getting tucked away in cliffs, disguised, hidden. Subtlety was the new style. And with that, Egyptian kings started shifting their image too. Middle Kingdom pharaohs weren't just distant gods on earth anymore, at least not entirely. They also liked to show themselves as approachable, fatherly, sometimes even vulnerable, which is a wild swing from "I'm literally Horus incarnate" to "look at me, the slightly tired but wise dad of Egypt." Take Pharaoh Senusret III, for example. His statues are famous for showing him with heavy eyelids, drooping cheeks, and a tired, worried expression, which, if you think about it, is almost revolutionary in royal art. Instead of showing himself as eternally young, eternally perfect, he basically said, "Yeah, being pharaoh is exhausting, and I look like I haven't slept in 5 years. Put that in stone." And his sculptors did, which makes Senusret the rare king who might actually have been relatable. Though, of course, He was still a pharaoh, meaning his relatable problems included controlling trade routes and ordering executions. Small details. Now, the Middle Kingdom also saw pharaohs experimenting with new strategies for keeping control. Instead of just flexing with giant monuments, they leaned harder into religion and literature. This was the era when wisdom texts, stories, and poetry flourished, which means, yes, pharaohs were sponsoring bedtime stories long before we got here. The Instructions of Amenemhat is basically a royal ghost memo from a murdered king telling his son, "Don't trust anyone, they're all out to get you." Very relaxing parenting advice. But behind the philosophy and pensive statues, the dynasties were still messy. Pharaohs married within the family. Royal mothers especially played powerful roles, sometimes more powerful than the kings themselves. In fact, some historians argue that the Middle Kingdom was basically run by royal mothers behind the throne, which makes sense since pharaohs were often very young when they inherited power, and nothing says eternal God on earth than being bossed around by your mom. Still, the Middle Kingdom wasn't all peace and wisdom scrolls. Egypt had to deal with constant border problems. Nubia in the south, Bedouins in the east, lots of raiders, rebels, and resource fights. Pharaohs built fortresses, launched campaigns, and spent a lot of time trying to remind everyone who was in charge, which meant statues of tired faces weren't just art, they were probably accurate mood boards. But as always, prosperity doesn't last forever. Around 1700 BCE, the Middle Kingdom crumbled and Egypt entered another messy period, the Second Intermediate Period, which sounds like a sequel nobody asked for. And this time, things got even weirder. Because during this period, Egypt got invaded by outsiders known as the Hyksos. These weren't aliens, despite what certain documentaries on late-night TV want you to believe. The Hyksos were likely Canaanite people from the Levant who took advantage of Egypt's political weakness. They marched in, took control of the northern delta, and ruled for a while, and the Egyptians, for once, had to deal with being the conquered instead of the conquerors, which did not sit well with them. The Hyksos introduced new technologies too, like the horse-drawn chariot. Egyptians hadn't been using those yet, so suddenly they had to play catch-up. Imagine the humiliation. You're the mighty builders of pyramids, the rulers of the Nile, and then some neighbors show up with flashy new horse carts and wreck your army. Not a good look. So yes, catch-up. Eventually, Egypt rallied. A southern dynasty rose in Thebes, pushed back against the Hyksos, and kicked them out. And with that, Egypt entered what's called the New Kingdom, the golden age of pharaohs, the era of big names like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II, basically the celebrities of Egyptian history. But before we rush there, let's pause and look at what all this means. From pyramids to vulnerable sculptures to foreign invasions, what we're really seeing is Egypt cycling through phases of ego, humility, and recovery. Kings go from "I'm eternal" to "I'm exhausted" to "oops, we lost to the neighbors," and back again. Which, if nothing else, makes them feel a little more human. Now, let's drift into the New Kingdom. And oh boy, this is where things get entertaining. The New Kingdom is like Egypt turned up to 11. Bigger temples, bolder personalities, stranger religious experiments, and of course, even more royal family dysfunction. Because if there's one thing Egyptian history never runs out of, it's divine egos in awkward marriages. We'll start with Hatshepsut. She's one of the most famous female pharaohs, ruling around 1470 BCE. Officially, she was supposed to just be regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut looked at the situation and thought, why stop at babysitting? I think I'll just run Egypt myself. And she did. She declared herself pharaoh, wore the royal regalia, and even had herself depicted in statues with a ceremonial beard. Because in ancient Egypt, nothing said authority like a fake chin wig. And honestly, she was good at it. Hatshepsut's reign was prosperous, filled with trade expeditions and temple building. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is still one of the most beautiful in Egypt. But of course, her stepson wasn't thrilled about being sidelined. When Thutmose III finally grew up and took the throne, he spent years trying to erase Hatshepsut's memory, chiseling her name off monuments, smashing statues, which, ironically, just made her even more famous later. Nothing says I mattered than someone going out of their way to delete you from history. Next we have Akhenaten. And if you thought pharaohs were eccentric before, buckle up. Akhenaten decided to change Egypt's entire religion. For centuries, Egyptians had worshipped a whole pantheon of gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, you name it. But Akhenaten said, nope, forget all that. From now on, we're all worshipping just one god, Aten, the sun disk, basically inventing monotheism in Egypt. He even moved the capital to a brand new city, Amarna, dedicated to Aten. He changed the art style too. Instead of stiff, idealized figures, he had himself portrayed with a weird, elongated head, spindly limbs, and a potbelly. Some think it was a new artistic freedom, others think he just looked like that. Either way, Akhenaten rebranded himself as the ultimate weirdo pharaoh. And then there's his son, Tutankhamun. Yes, King Tut, the boy king who took the throne around age 9 and died by 19. His reign wasn't especially important, but his tomb was, because it was one of the only royal tombs found mostly intact in modern times. And when Howard Carter opened it in 1922, the world went absolutely nuts. Gold, treasures, masks. Tut became the most famous pharaoh, despite doing almost nothing of note while alive, which is, frankly, the most relatable historical achievement. And finally, we have Ramses II, Ramses the Great. If pharaohs were rock stars, Ramses was Elvis, Mick Jagger, and Beyoncé rolled into one. He ruled for 66 years, built temples everywhere, and carved his name on more monuments than anyone else. He even fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, which he declared a glorious victory, even though it was basically a stalemate. Ramses was the ultimate self-promoter. If Instagram had existed, his account would have been intolerable. And yet, for all their grandeur, all their monuments, all their divine pretensions, they were still just humans, inbred.
So here we are, dozing in the golden glow of Egypt's new kingdom. The pyramids are long behind us, replaced by sprawling temples, colossal statues, and pharaohs with a flair for over-the-top self-promotion. If the Old Kingdom was all about stone triangles, the New Kingdom was about stone selfies. And no one perfected the art of the stone selfie quite like Ramses II, Ramses the Great, the pharaoh who said, "If I can't live forever, I'll just make sure my face is everywhere." He ruled for 66 years, which for the ancient world was practically an eternity. Imagine outlasting most of your political enemies simply by stubbornly refusing to die. That was Ramses. By the end, people probably forgot what Egypt was like without him. Ramses didn't just rule, he plastered his name and image across the country. Temples, obelisks, colossal statues, all proudly shouting, Ramses was here. Some weren't even his. He had no shame about chiseling out earlier kings' names and carving in his own. It's like ancient Photoshop, but with a hammer and chisel. His most famous monument? Abu Simbel. 2 enormous seated statues of Ramses, each about 66 feet tall, staring across the Nile like giant stone action figures. The message was clear. Don't forget me, don't even try. And honestly, it worked. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about him. Now, Ramses was also known for the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittites around 1274 BCE. It's one of the earliest battles in history where we have detailed accounts. According to Ramses' inscriptions, it was a glorious Egyptian victory. According to the Hittites, it was also their victory, which basically means it was a draw, but neither side wanted to admit it. Typical. Ramses, being Ramses, had his version carved in temples across Egypt, complete with dramatic illustrations of him charging into battle alone, mowing down enemies like some kind of chariot superhero, which, let's be honest, probably didn't happen. But if you control the narrative, you can make yourself look like the ancient Egyptian Chuck Norris. He also had a famously huge family, dozens of wives, more than 100 children. His favorite queen, Nefertari, got her own stunning temple at Abu Simbel, which is about as good as an ancient Valentine's gift gets. The sheer scale of his offspring meant that by the time Ramses finally died in his 90s, half the royal court was made up of his kids, which, unsurprisingly, caused some messy succession disputes later, because nothing says smooth transition of power than 20 sons all thinking they should be next in line. But Ramses' reign was the high point. After him, things started wobbling. His successors weren't as impressive. They still built temples, still pretended Egypt was at the height of glory, but the truth was cracks were forming. Economically, militarily, politically, the empire was straining under its own weight. By the time we reached the late New Kingdom, Egypt had developed what we might call pharaoh fatigue. Pharaohs came and went. Some ruled for only a year or two. Others tried to cling to Ramses' legacy by naming themselves after him. Ramses III, Ramses IV, Ramses V, all the way up to Ramses XI. It was like a dynasty of tribute bands, each one trying to be Ramses the Great, but never quite pulling it off. Ramses III, for example, did have one major moment, fighting off the Sea Peoples. And no, that's not a bad 80s band name. The Sea Peoples were mysterious raiders who appeared out of nowhere around the 12th century BCE, attacking kingdoms all over the eastern Mediterranean. Nobody knows exactly who they were, possibly displaced groups from multiple regions, but they showed up with ships, weapons, and bad attitudes, and they smashed through kingdoms like a traveling apocalypse. Ramses III faced them head-on, and, according to Egyptian records, won. His inscriptions proudly show the Sea Peoples being slaughtered, their ships capsizing, chaos everywhere. It was one of the last great military victories of Egypt. But even Ramses III couldn't stop the overall decline, because while he might have beaten the Sea Peoples once, the economic strain, invasions, and internal problems just kept piling up. And Ramses III's own family story? Oh, it gets juicy. He was the victim of what's now called the harem conspiracy. Basically, one of his wives, not satisfied with her son's place in the royal succession, plotted to assassinate him. The plot involved magic wax figurines, court officials, and probably way too much gossip whispered behind palace curtains. The assassination succeeded. Ramses III's mummy shows his throat was slit, which means that even the great defender of Egypt, even the last truly powerful Ramses, ended up falling to palace intrigue. After that, it was all downhill. The new kingdom crumbled. Egypt entered yet another intermediate period. This time, instead of building pyramids or grand temples, pharaohs mostly struggled to hold on to any real power at all. Priests of Amun and Thebes became more powerful than the kings. Local governors did their own thing. Foreigners crept in again. Libyans, Nubians, Syrians. Egypt was still rich in culture and resources, but politically, it was a mess. And when we talk about pharaohs in this later period, the word tragic starts to apply more than great. Many were short-lived rulers, often manipulated by court officials. Some left barely a trace in the archaeological record. Others, desperate to revive Egypt's glory, just made awkward copies of what had already been done better centuries earlier. It's like a band that peaked with its first album and then spent the rest of its career releasing uninspired remixes. One especially sad figure was Pasamidi III, who reigned in the 6th century BCE. He had the misfortune of being the last native pharaoh before Persia conquered Egypt. His reign lasted about 6 months. Imagine finally making it to the throne, only to have the Persian Empire roll in before you've even finished decorating your palace. Not exactly a triumphant career. And yet, despite these failures, Egyptians still clung to the image of pharaohs as divine.
Even when foreign powers like Persia, Greece, and Rome took over, they often styled themselves as pharaohs too, just to fit in. Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, founded Alexandria, and let the priests crown him as a pharaoh. He knew good branding when he saw it. Later, the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander's generals, ruled Egypt for centuries while pretending to be proper Egyptian monarchs, which worked, sort of. They learned the rituals, married their siblings just like old times, and built temples in traditional styles. And of course, this eventually gave us Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra. Not the first Cleopatra, there were several before her, all part of the Ptolemaic dynasty's confusing naming tradition. But the famous Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruling in the 1st century BCE. By then, Egypt was essentially a pawn in the bigger game of Roman politics. Cleopatra tried to keep Egypt independent by aligning herself with powerful Roman men, Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. But in the end, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, won the Roman Civil War, and Cleopatra lost everything. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of pharaonic Egypt. After her, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The pyramids and temples still stood, the Nile still flooded each year, but the age of god-kings was gone. From then on, pharaohs lived only in memory, stone, and bedtime stories. And that perhaps is the most poetic part. Because for all the grandeur, all the divine titles, all the sibling marriages and stone propaganda, Egypt's rulers ended the same way as everyone else: mortal, fallible, and eventually forgotten. Their pyramids stood, but their names crumbled. Their treasures dazzled, but only for the robbers who found them. Their dynasties rose and fell, leaving behind ruins that now serve as background scenery for tourists taking selfies. So as you sink deeper into your pillow tonight, picture Ramses' statues at Abu Simbel still staring out over the desert, unblinking. Imagine Cleopatra on her barge, sailing the Nile with silver sails, knowing her dynasty's days were numbered. Imagine Khufu's pyramid looming under the stars, a mountain of stone built just to make one man feel eternal. And remember that in the end, all of it, the pyramids, the temples, the royal dramas, has turned into the quiet hum of history, a lullaby in stone.
So, we've floated past the grandeur of the Old Kingdom pyramids. We've wandered through the sun-drenched drama of Ramses and his temple selfies, and now we arrive at the final act of Egyptian royalty. The Greeks, who showed up, unpacked their sandals and said, "Sure, we'll be pharaohs now." Enter the Ptolemaic dynasty. It all began with Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, at the ripe age of 32, proving even history's rock stars don't live forever, his massive empire got sliced up like a badly shared pizza. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. Why? Because it was rich, strategically placed, and had a population used to bowing down to god-kings. For an ambitious warlord looking to legitimize himself, Egypt was basically the jackpot. Ptolemy and his descendants ruled Egypt for almost 3 centuries, and in those 3 centuries, they perfected one particular royal skill: dysfunctional family politics. Now, the Ptolemies aren't native Egyptians. They were Greek, Macedonian to be precise. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and generally considered themselves far too sophisticated for the local culture. But crucially, they realized Egyptians really loved their pharaohs. So, in a move of political genius, the Ptolemies styled themselves as proper Egyptian kings and queens. They got themselves depicted in traditional pharaonic art, dressed in the old regalia, and nodded politely to the priests. On the walls of temples, you'd see them offering gifts to Horus or Isis. But behind closed doors, They were speaking Greek, eating Greek food, and squabbling like characters from a tragic soap opera. And let's talk about those squabbles. The Ptolemies had one particular habit: marrying their siblings. It wasn't exactly a new idea. The old pharaohs had done it too. But the Ptolemies turned it into a family tradition, like awkward holiday dinners except with crowns and incest. Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II, earning them the nickname Philadelphoi, or sibling lovers. Subtle. And once that precedent was set, generation after generation followed suit. Brother married sister, cousin married cousin, uncles married nieces. It was a family tree that folded in on itself like a badly copied origami swan. Now, was this about romance? Absolutely not. It was about power, keeping the royal bloodline pure, consolidating authority, and making sure no outsiders got a piece of the throne. Which sounds fine in theory, until you realize it created a dynasty where everyone was both your sibling and your potential murderer. And speaking of murder, the Ptolemies loved a good family killing. Assassinations, poisonings, palace coups. It was basically their version of game night. If you thought medieval Europe had messy successions, the Ptolemies said, "Hold my amphora." Take Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, which translates to potbelly. Not exactly a flattering title for a king, but he earned it. He was infamous for his cruelty and his sheer lack of subtlety. At one point, he had his own nephew murdered on his wedding day, during the feast, and then forced his mother to attend the dismemberment. Relaxing family event, right? He also married his sister, Cleopatra II, then dumped her to marry her daughter, his own niece, Cleopatra III. Yes, he married his wife's daughter. Family dinners must have been tense. And yet, despite all this dysfunction, the Ptolemies kept ruling because Egypt was wealthy, strategically important, and the Mediterranean powers kept cutting deals with whoever had the throne at the moment. The dynasty survived constant coups, shifting alliances, and the occasional civil war, all while keeping up appearances with giant temples and public festivals. Fast forward a bit, and we arrive at the most famous Ptolemy of all, Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra. Not Cleopatra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Yes, there were that many before her. But Cleopatra VII was the one who became legend. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE into this whirlwind of palace intrigue and family drama. By the time she was 18, she was co-ruling Egypt with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. And of course, because this was the Ptolemies, they were also married. Nothing says happy family business like being forced to wed your preteen sibling. But Cleopatra was different from many of her predecessors. She wasn't just a puppet for advisors or a figurehead for the priests. She was ambitious, intelligent, and multilingual. Unlike most Ptolemies, she actually learned to speak Egyptian in addition to Greek. She knew how to charm, how to manipulate, and how to project authority, which made her both powerful and dangerous. Her relationship with her brother husband deteriorated fast. Factions formed, civil war broke out, and just when things were getting messy, Rome stepped in. Because by this point, Egypt was basically under Roman protection, which is a polite way of saying, you're independent until we decide you're not. And who should arrive in Alexandria but Julius Caesar himself? This was Cleopatra's golden opportunity. She smuggled herself into his quarters, rolled up in a rug. Yes, the famous story, though some versions say it was a laundry sack. Whichever way, it worked. Caesar was charmed. He backed Cleopatra against her brother. Ptolemy XIII ended up drowned in the Nile during the fighting, and Cleopatra was firmly in charge. She also had a child with Caesar, little Caesarion, officially named Ptolemy XV. The name basically screamed, yes, he's Egyptian royalty, but please notice his Roman paternity. For a while, Cleopatra's strategy seemed perfect. Align with Rome's top man, secure Egypt's throne, and keep her dynasty alive. Of course, Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE ruined that plan. Cleopatra then set her sights on another Roman power player, Antony, one of Caesar's top allies. Their relationship became the stuff of legend: lavish feasts, golden barges, endless gossip. Together, they had 3 children and presented themselves as the glamorous power couple of the Eastern Mediterranean. But Rome being Rome, nothing stays stable for long. Antony and Cleopatra faced off against Octavian, Caesar's heir, and in 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, their fleet was crushed. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Him with a sword, she supposedly with an asp, though historians debate whether it was really poison. Either way, it was a suitably tragic ending. So, Cleopatra is gone. Her eyeliner fades into legend, her golden barge floats quietly out of sight, and Egypt has been scooped up by Rome like an expensive trinket. We've reached 30 BCE, and Octavian, soon to be Augustus, declares Egypt a Roman province. And here's the thing. For the Romans, Egypt wasn't just another province. It was their breadbasket. The Nile's fertile floods grew grain in obscene quantities, grain that Rome needed. Because if the people of Rome didn't get their bread, they got cranky. And cranky Romans tended to riot. So Egypt became vital, not for its temples or its gods, but for its wheat. Rome, of course, also loved Egypt's aesthetic. The pyramids, the obelisks, the mummies, they were all exotic curiosities to collect and repurpose. Emperors shipped obelisks back to Rome to decorate circuses and forums, like very large lawn ornaments. They dragged statues, sphinxes, and chunks of temples across the Mediterranean. Even today, if you wander through Rome, Paris, or London, you'll find Egyptian obelisks standing awkwardly in the middle of piazzas, like ancient souvenirs that never got returned. But let's step back a little. What was life actually like in Egypt under Roman rule? Well, for starters, Egypt was treated differently than other provinces. Augustus didn't want ambitious senators meddling in his new toy, so only the emperor himself could appoint Egypt's governor, usually a knight, not a senator. This meant Egypt was basically Augustus's private property. He owned it like a personal estate, with the sight of sphinxes. The governor of Egypt, called the prefect, wielded enormous power, but it came with a heavy job description: keep the grain flowing. As long as grain ships reached Rome on time, the prefect was safe. If they didn't, well, no one wanted to see Augustus angry. And while Rome controlled Egypt politically, the cultural blend kept simmering. Temples still operated, priests still performed rituals, Egyptians still worshipped Isis, Osiris, Horus, and the rest of their pantheon. But now Roman emperors started slipping into the role of pharaoh. Not in the old sense. They weren't doing daily rituals in Karnak. But on temple walls, you'd still see Augustus or Tiberius depicted in full pharaonic regalia, offering incense to Ra. It was a polite nod to tradition, a way of saying, yes, yes, we know you love your gods, carry on. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Egyptian religion was suddenly fashionable. The cult of Isis spread like wildfire. Roman matrons flocked to her temples. Priests of Isis paraded through the streets in elaborate processions, chanting and carrying sistrums. It was exotic, mystical, and just edgy enough to annoy traditional Roman conservatives. Because if there's one thing Roman elites hated, it was foreign cults distracting people from worshiping boring old Jupiter. Now, let's talk about the pyramids in this era. By the time Augustus arrived in Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already over 2,500 years old. To put that in perspective, Cleopatra lived closer in time to us than she did to the pyramid builders. For the Romans, the pyramids were already unfathomably ancient. Tourists flocked to them much like we do today. Graffiti carved by Roman visitors still survives inside the Great Pyramid. Little notes etched in Greek or Latin saying things like, so-and-so is here. Proof that history's first tourists were just as tacky as modern ones. Some emperors couldn't resist trying to one-up Egypt's wonders. Caligula, in one of his more flamboyant moods, reportedly wanted to dismantle the Great Pyramid and cart it back to Rome stone by stone. Fortunately, the logistics defeated him. Nero, always eager for drama, posed himself as a pharaoh in artistic depictions. Hadrian, emperor famous for building walls, actually toured Egypt in person. He and his companion, Antinous, floated down the Nile visiting temples and monuments like any wealthy traveler. After Antinous tragically drowned in the river, Hadrian declared him a god and built a city in his honor. Egypt, for the Romans, wasn't just grain, it was theater. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians carried on much as before. Farmers tilled the fields along the Nile, priests maintained their temples, craftsmen carved statues for Roman tourists, but life grew harder in some ways. Roman taxation was heavy, and uprisings occasionally broke out. Most were quickly crushed. Egypt was simply too valuable for Rome to lose. But over time, the old traditions began to fade. Temples declined as Christianity spread through the empire. By the 4th century CE, under emperors like Theodosius, pagan worship was officially outlawed. Temples were shuttered, Priests vanished. The hieroglyphic script, once carved proudly into stone, fell into disuse. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE, a small, sad epitaph for a language that had endured for 3 millennia. And yet, even as their culture dimmed, Egypt's monuments endured. The pyramids, temples, and colossal statues stood silently, too massive to erase. Travelers still came. Christian pilgrims, Byzantine officials, wandering monks all stared up at the pyramids in awe. They didn't understand them. They barely remembered who built them, but they knew they were old, mysterious, and impressive. Let's float back for a moment to one of the most quietly fascinating things about this era, the Roman habit of collecting mummies. Yes, collecting. Roman elites developed a taste for Egyptian mummies and even ground them up to use in medicine and potions. By late antiquity, the trade in mummies was brisk. Wrapped bodies pulled from the desert sands were shipped across the empire as curiosities. It's hard to imagine a more bizarre afterlife than being pulverized into a powder so some rich senator could sprinkle you into his wine. But that was Egypt under Rome, a land simultaneously sacred and commodified. The emperors honored its gods while looting its obelisks. Tourists admired its temples while scribbling graffiti on the walls. Priests clung to rituals while governors extracted grain. A contradiction, wrapped up nicely in desert sand. And maybe the most bittersweet part? For the Romans, Egypt's monuments were already ancient relics of a vanished golden age. They didn't know the pyramid builders' names. They couldn't read hieroglyphics. To them, the pyramids were as mysterious as they are to us today. They marveled, they speculated, they gossiped, but the truth of the Old Kingdom was already out of reach. History had folded in on itself, leaving behind stone and silence. So, as the sun sets on Roman Egypt, picture it. The Nile flowing endlessly, barges heavy with grain sailing north to feed Rome, while curious travelers carve their names into pyramid walls. Picture Augustus in Pharaoh's regalia, pretending to offer incense he didn't believe in. Picture Hadrian, grieving Antinous, staring into the Nile's waters and wondering if even gods could drown. It's quiet now. The temples are emptying, the chants of Isis fade into whispers, but the pyramids remain, unmoved, as they always have, watching, waiting, outlasting yet another empire that thought itself eternal. And with that thought, let's settle in, because Egypt under Rome was less about glory, more about endurance. The land went on, the people went on, and the monuments, those patient piles of stone, simply kept standing, while the world around them shifted like sand.
So here we are. We've wandered with workers hauling limestone in the blazing sun. We've peeked inside chambers where pharaohs once lay, wrapped up like very expensive birthday presents. We floated through centuries of silence, when nobody really paid much attention to the pyramids, except perhaps the occasional shepherd or wandering mystic. Then we've stumbled into the modern rediscovery. Napoleon's sketchbooks, mummy parties, and Europeans dragging obelisks across oceans like decorative lawn ornaments. And yet, after all that, the pyramids are still here, still squatting in the desert, still doing their giant stone thing. That's the funny part. All this human drama, all the dynasties, the conquerors, the religions, the tourists with their scribbled journals, has come and gone. The pyramids just stayed, patient, immovable, watching the centuries pile up like so much drifting sand. Let's sit with that image for a bit. Imagine the Great Pyramid at night. The desert cools, The stars sprawl above in a sky so clear it almost hurts. At the base of the pyramid, sand whispers in the wind. No crowds, no archaeologists, just stone, silence, and time. That's been the backdrop for nearly 5,000 years. Empires rose, kings strutted, revolutions sparked, and the pyramid just kept standing, not particularly impressed. And humans, of course, can't resist attaching meaning to it. We've called it a tomb, a temple, a treasure vault, a star map, an alien landing pad, if you believe the fringe crowd. The truth is probably the most boring option. It's a monument, a very large, very expensive way of saying, look, I'm important. Don't forget me. Which is ironic, because almost every name etched into history has faded, while the stone pile itself remains. Take Khufu, the man behind the Great Pyramid. Once hailed as the big boss of Egypt, worshipped as a living god, remembered as a tyrant by some, a visionary by others. Today, most people couldn't tell you a single thing about him. They might not even remember his name. But his pyramid, everyone knows that. It's practically his only biography. Imagine being reduced to geometry. Not a king, not a story, just a giant triangle in the sand. That's legacy for you. And maybe that's why the pyramids still fascinate. They remind us how small we are compared to time. They're not romantic like castles. They're not cozy like ruins of temples in Greece. They're blunt, impersonal. Huge stone blocks stacked into a shape that doesn't care what you think. There's a kind of comfort in that. Of course, that hasn't stopped humans from fussing endlessly over them, measuring angles, debating construction techniques, speculating about secret chambers. Every few years, some new discovery pops up. Thermal scans hinting at voids inside, robots creeping down shafts, radar bouncing off hidden cavities. Each announcement sparks headlines about mysteries finally solved. And then, inevitably, it fizzles out, because the pyramids keep their secrets just tightly enough to stay interesting. And honestly, that's probably best. If everything about them were explained, they'd lose some of their sleepy allure. Imagine if we could prove beyond doubt how every stone was placed. Imagine if we mapped every corridor, labeled every block, reconstructed every ceremony. Would the pyramids still feel magical? Or would they just become a big construction project? A dusty spreadsheet of man-hours and limestone tonnage? Better perhaps to leave some mystery hanging in the air. Let's think too about the people who built them. Not just the pharaohs, not just the overseers with their whips and clipboards, but the thousands of ordinary workers. Men hauling ropes, women baking bread, children running errands, carrying water jars, probably rolling their eyes at their parents' complaints about back pain. We imagine pyramids as cold and silent, but in their making, they were full of noise. Singing, shouting, laughter, arguments, the mess of human life pressed into labor for a monument that none of them would ever really own. Those workers are long gone, their names forgotten, their bones scattered into the soil. And yet, their fingerprints are still hidden in the blocks. Literally. Some quarry marks, some scrawled graffiti still survive inside chambers that were never meant to be seen. Little jokes, team nicknames, proud signatures. The faintest whispers of the people behind the stone. Their pharaoh may be dust, but their doodles remain. That's kind of wonderful, isn't it? So as we wind down this long stroll through pyramid history, maybe the real story isn't just about kings and tombs. It's about endurance, about the persistence of stone versus the fragility of human life. The pyramids are older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than Stonehenge. They're practically older than the concept of history itself. And they'll probably still be there long after we're gone, staring blandly at the desert as our skyscrapers crumble and our satellites drift silently out of orbit. The pyramids are patient. That's their trick. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to speak. They just sit. And by doing nothing, they outlast everything. It's no wonder people project mystery onto them. We're not really looking at stone blocks when we stare at the pyramids. We're looking at ourselves, our fears of being forgotten, our desire for permanence, our absurd human urge to shout into eternity, "I was here!" Pharaohs did it with limestone. We do it with Instagram. Different tools, same instinct. And maybe, if you squint, the pyramids do whisper back. Not in hieroglyphs, not in secret codes, but in their sheer, stubborn existence. A quiet message that says, yes, you will vanish. Yes, your name will be forgotten. But something of you might endure. A work, a trace, a mark left behind. It won't last forever. Nothing does. But longer than you think. Long enough to matter. So, when you close your eyes tonight, drifting towards sleep, picture the pyramids under starlight. No tourists, no cameras, no chatter. Just ancient stone against the sky. Think about all the lives that came and went under their gaze. Think about how much time has passed. And then let that thought dissolve until it's just silence. The pyramids aren't going anywhere, and neither are you for the moment. So, rest. So here we are. We've wandered with workers hauling limestone in the blazing sun. We've peeked inside chambers where pharaohs once lay, wrapped up like very expensive birthday presents. We've floated through centuries of silence when nobody really paid much attention to the pyramids, except perhaps the occasional shepherd or wandering mystic. Then we've stumbled into the modern rediscovery, Napoleon's sketchbooks, mummy parties, and Europeans dragging obelisks across oceans like decorative lawn ornaments. And yet, after all that, the pyramids are still here, still squatting in the desert, still doing their giant stone thing. That's the funny part. All this human drama, all the dynasties, the conquerors, the religions, the tourists with their scribbled journals, has come and gone. The pyramids just stayed, patient, immovable, watching the centuries pile up like so much drifting sand. Let's sit with that image for a bit. Imagine the Great Pyramid at night. The desert cools, the stars sprawl above in a sky so clear it almost hurts. At the base of the pyramid, sand whispers in the wind. No crowds, no archaeologists, just stone, silence, and time. That's been the backdrop for nearly 5,000 years. Empires rose, kings strutted, revolutions sparked, and the pyramid just kept standing, not particularly impressed. And humans, of course, can't resist attaching meaning to it. We've called it a tomb, a temple, a treasure vault, a star map, an alien landing pad, if you believe the fringe crowd. The truth is probably the most boring option. It's a monument, a very large, very expensive way of saying, look, I'm important, don't forget me. Which is ironic, because almost every name etched into history has faded, while the stone pile itself remains. Take Khufu, the man behind the Great Pyramid. Once hailed as the big boss of Egypt, worshipped as a living god, remembered as a tyrant by some, a visionary by others, today
most people couldn't tell you a single thing about him. They might not even remember his name. But his pyramid, everyone knows that. It's practically his only biography. Imagine being reduced to geometry. Not a king, not a story, just a giant triangle in the sand. That's legacy for you. And maybe that's why the pyramids still fascinate. They remind us how small we are compared to time. They're not romantic like castles. They're not cozy like ruins of temples in Greece. They're blunt, impersonal, huge stone blocks stacked into a shape that doesn't care what you think. There is a kind of comfort in that. Of course, that hasn't stopped humans from fussing endlessly over them, measuring angles, debating construction techniques, speculating about secret chambers. Every few years, some new discovery pops up. Thermal scans hinting at voids inside, robots creeping down shafts, radar bouncing off hidden cavities. Each announcement sparks headlines about mysteries finally solved, and then, inevitably, it fizzles out because the pyramids keep their secrets just tightly enough to stay interesting. And honestly, that's probably best. If everything about them were explained, they'd lose some of their sleepy allure. Imagine if we could prove beyond doubt how every stone was placed. Imagine if we mapped every corridor, labeled every block, reconstructed every ceremony. Would the pyramids still feel magical? Or would they just become a big construction project? A dusty spreadsheet of man-hours and limestone tonnage? Better perhaps to leave some mystery hanging in the air. Let's think, too, about the people who built them. Not just the pharaohs, not just the overseers with their whips and clipboards, but the thousands of ordinary workers. Men hauling ropes, women baking bread, children running errands, carrying water jars, probably rolling their eyes at their parents' complaints about back pain. We imagine pyramids as cold and silent, but in their making, they were full of noise. Singing, shouting, laughter, arguments. The mess of human life pressed into labor for a monument that none of them would ever really own. Those workers are long gone. Their names forgotten, their bones scattered into the soil, and yet their fingerprints are still hidden in the blocks. Literally. Some quarry marks, some scrawled graffiti still survive in chambers that were never meant to be seen. Little jokes, team nicknames, proud signatures, the faintest whispers of the people behind the stone. Their pharaoh may be dust, but their doodles remain. That's kind of wonderful, isn't it? So as we wind down this long stroll through pyramid history, maybe the real story isn't just about kings and tombs. It's about endurance, about the persistence of stone versus the fragility of human life. The pyramids are older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than Stonehenge. They're practically older than the concept of history itself. And they'll probably still be there long after we're gone, staring blandly at the desert as our skyscrapers crumble and our satellites drift silently out of orbit. The pyramids are patient. That's their trick. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to speak. They just sit. And by doing nothing, they outlast everything. It's no wonder people project mystery onto them. We're not really looking at stone blocks when we stare at the pyramids. We're looking at ourselves, our fears of being forgotten, our desire for permanence, our absurd human urge to shout into eternity, "I was here!" Pharaohs did it with limestone. We do it with Instagram. Different tools, same instinct. And maybe if you squint, the pyramids do whisper back. Not in hieroglyphs, not in secret codes, but in their sheer stubborn existence. A quiet message that says, yes, you will vanish. Yes, your name will be forgotten. But something of you might endure. A work, a trace, a mark left behind. It won't last forever, nothing does, but longer than you think. Long enough to matter. So when you close your eyes tonight, drifting towards sleep, picture the pyramids under starlight. No tourists, no cameras, no chatter. Just ancient stone against the sky. Think about all the lives that came and went under their gaze. Think about how much time has passed. And then let that thought dissolve until it's just silence. The pyramids aren't going anywhere, and neither are you, for the moment. So rest.